We are delighted to welcome Travis Williams. Travis is going to talk with us about symbols of recognition and the road to redress. You are a UGA graduate, is that right? What class was that?
Yes, ma'am. 2005 school law.
Awesome. And right now you're a practicing attorney?
I'm actually back in school working towards hopefully a PhD in social work at some point.
Then why don't I let you introduce yourself?
That's my end goal, put it that way.
Super. Love to hear from you. We're excited to have you here today. You have some very timely information to share with us. And so that I do not continue to make mistakes, I'll ask you to share your own bio and tell us what you want to know about you. Then that gives you this entire 30 minutes to share with us what you want to tell us about the symbols that we are currently addressing.
Okay, well, 3 o'clock is breaking into my snack time, so.
Sorry.
It's all good. It's all good. So I'm gonna share my screen now.
Thank you.
All right, so my name is Travis Williams. UGA alum and back at UGA again, working on my master's in social work. Hope to teach at a school of social work. And the role of social workers has grown so much in the criminal legal system and other social services. And I just see a lot of opportunities there to get people engaged in real justice work. So, so today we'll be talking about symbolism and what that means from a political action, community grassroots organizing framework, and how that plays into the outcomes, right, that we get as oppressed Black people facing serious anti-Black racism, not just from the nation and general people or ideas, but specifically here at the University of Georgia. All right, so we'll start with do some framing to help us walk through the conversation, and then we'll go from there. Ms. Davis, just keep me posted on the time, and I know you will, so I don't even got to worry about that. But so, because I'm stream of consciousness, so we'll just be kind of flowing and go what we got. So to understand the discussion we're about to have, it's 4 ideas that it kind of set our frame on this discussion that we're about to have. And that's a accrued disadvantage, the idea of stigma, understanding stigma, the idea of recognition, and our conception of justice, right?
Yeah.
So accrued disadvantage, when we think of accrued, we think of accrued interest, right? So accrued interest is an accounting term that refers to the amount of interest that has been incurred as of a specific date but has not yet been paid. When we think of disadvantage, disadvantage is a term that is commonly used to describe an unfavorable circumstance or condition that reduces the chances of success or effectiveness, right? So when we build this idea of accrued disadvantage, I heard a political activist mention it, Yvette Carnell, and it was just blew my mind a few years ago when I heard her describe it. And since then, I've thought a lot about it and really fleshed out the idea from a functional standpoint for me to better understand it and in short that these harms put upon Black folk by institutions like Georgia. And when I speak of institutions, I'm talking of any organization that mediates between the people and the state. That's what an institution is. It mediates between the people and the state, right? So these things don't happen in a vacuum. And sometimes I think that the best way to really understand that, the best way to frame American history is understanding it really is 3 phases and maybe a 4th phase now. And that's slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and whatever we are entering into now, right? While the era of mass incarceration is still upon us and still crushing numerous Black families, that's the best way to understand it, right? So slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration. And when I talk about Black people, I talk about slavery or Jim Crow, I'm not talking about some make-believe hypothetical Negro I kind of met one time. I read about it in a book. I'm talking about my family, who is, and I think this is the best way to sort of frame this idea of accrued disadvantage. So my grandfather's grandfather was born a slave, last born slave in my family, 1846, right? So Lewis was born in Claxton, Georgia, right? That's where my family is from, Evans County. And he had a grandson eventually, which was my grandfather, who him and my granny were ran out of South Georgia by the just everything of white supremacy, right? And and then he had 7 kids, and between the harms caused that began to add up and began to accrue, right? The disinvestment in Black life, Black outcomes, putting Black people in a position to not be able to put together a life that makes sense, right? Real harm and real damage. He had 7 kids, in between HIV/AIDS and prison and addiction and just the sheer violence of our environment wiped most of them off the table, right? And so you think about that, and then the era of mass incarceration took my parents away and left me in a state of total social disarray. So we think of the accrued disadvantage assigned to Black life. We have to understand that a parent has a parent, and a child as a grandparent, and so forth and so on. These things begin to not just add up, but they begin to accrue, and the cost associated that has been fed into our community becomes so great that individuals and individual families deeply suffer and are in many ways socially crippled, right? So that's just a way to understand accrued disadvantage. And so stigma, when we talk about stigma as a institutional how it expresses itself in institutional and social life, we're talking about spoiled identity, right? We're talking about making identity claims that are defective. Persons suffering from stigma are discredited as social and institutional actors, right? That's really clear in the Jim Crow era, when Black person couldn't do this. It's much more subtle now, and that discrediting is so bled in that it's very difficult to see. That's why it's been so difficult to really understand and see the real harm and real cost of mass incarceration and recognition. So to recognize a person it creates an obligation for the observer, right? To cultivate and defend through a process of what would kind of feel like, or express itself as solidarity, express universal respect, and by respect I mean recognize an acceptable, perhaps even ideal autonomy and dignity in the recognized person, for the recognized in all institutional and social interactions and relations. So it's not just I see you as a person or as a human, but I'm going to defend your autonomy, your dignity, and by defending your autonomy, to totally restructure the choice structure that has been imposed upon me that through my social condition. Right. And so when we think about justice, justice as what I describe as an institutional artifact. So it's something that a institution creates and hands out like a product, versus justice as an express moral and intellectual virtue, right? The ultimate, the ultimate intellectual virtue is truth, right? Everything we're trying to, when we're thinking about something, we're trying to learn something, we're pursuing intellectual excellence. It is the end goal is always truth, and the express moral ends of something is a conception of a good life, right? The good life, a good life, we could even say, right? So an institutional justice as an institutional artifact would be, for example, Derek Chauvin being convicted, right? While an example of justice as an express and intellectual moral virtue would be something that would prevent Derek Chauvin from existing, right? But in order for him to not exist, you need George Floyd, who went to a D school in Houston. Houston failed him, right? We failed him, right? So an institutional artifact can sometimes have those contours to it, right? Like Breonna Taylor was killed by a no-knock as a result of a botched no-knock warrant, and those officers that did it are deplorable institutional actors. But justice for Breonna would be a all-out ban on no-knock warrants, right? That would be justice for Breonna. So symbolism is the idea that things represent other things, right? So when we think of you know, that's pretty obvious, right? So when we think of like what is some symbols, some explicit, what I call explicit symbols that we experience on a regular basis, well, one of those is a stop sign, right? And a stop sign is obviously explicit as a word that says stop, right? But it's so explicit, even a person without the ability to read understands what it means. That's how express it is, right? And it's not just the red, it's not just the shape, it's not just the words. It's permeated itself in every way because of how explicit it is. And you can put it at the end of a presentation, people know it's over. You can put it in the middle of a ignored and ignored Black cemetery, and people know that this is the end of it. And it could also mean the end of us allowing you to ignore it. So just to think through that. So when we think about vague symbols, we're talking about a good example, I think, is the Baldwin Hall Memorial, right? It's a big, probably marble thing, right? And it has words on it, but it could also just be art. If I don't know what it is, if I don't walk up and read it, it could just be art. So I can be a student that goes to UGA that chooses to ignore, would like to ignore the plunder and the pillage of the Black people here in Athens, and I'm able to do so if vague symbols exist, and I don't have to appreciate it each time. So an explicit symbol is a symbol that is you can't ignore. An explicit symbol demands constant critical reflection on the thing the symbol represents, right? And so the Athens Confederate Monument, although just kind of like a thing that just kind of stood up, most Confederate statues are very explicit symbols. It's usually a phallic symbol, or it's a racist doing something racist. So you see a Confederate soldier on a horse going to do something that a Confederate would do, right? So you don't have to. It's not much room for misinterpretation. It's not much room for misunderstanding about what this represents. You see how explicit these symbols are where they place them. They usually place them in prominent places in the commons or in public spaces, right? So that they can't be ignored. So you have to reflect and remember that. Not, you know, I grew up around nothing but Black people my entire life until I moved to Athens and started going to UGA. And you know, what was strange to me in 2005 was all the Confederate flags everywhere. At that time, I felt like it was everywhere. But I had nobody would ride a Confederate flag through my neighborhood. That would be insane. So to experience that here was rough. And incredibly explicit symbol, right? So how do vague symbols discourage political action? Vague symbols distort the acts that constitute the harm, right? So we'll use the Baldwin Hall Memorial as an example. You would think that it was just one act and not hundreds of disparate acts and distinct acts that created that destroyed those people to the extent that there just remains under a building, right? So it distorts the harm to being some kind of thing that happened one time, or some kind of thing that kind of sort of happened. And a stronger way to not do that, obviously, would be a marker and recognition for each of the people that those remains represented at one point, right? So in vague symbols also discourage political action by limiting the who of the harm, by expanding the who to the point of flatness and eventually erasure, right? So it could be anyone, right? And it applies to anyone, and we shouldn't let that happen to anyone, right? So it gets to the point to where you in erasure and flatness essentially it erases your family's contribution. I'm not from here, right? I may not be owed any direct compensation for what happened here, but I'm willing to lay down my life and everything I have so that these people get what is owed to them. And that's more than just a wave and we feel bad about this and here's a thank you card, but financial direct payment, right? So vague symbols give cover to institutions and institutional actors, right? So instead of paying me the $5 you owe me, you offer me an art piece to commemorate all people that were robbed of $5 by you, right? That gives institutional actors a chance to hide behind that instead of paying you the $5 that I owed you. And it may be $5 trillion what's owed to the people, to the Black people of Athens, how they've been plundered. So vague symbols have equally mobilizing value for harmed persons and for people that those people, for the people that did the wrong, right? So vague symbols don't demand critical reflection. Vague symbols separate the harm from contemporary concern. That was something that happened a long time ago. Slavery isn't that long ago. If my grandfather, who I spent considerable time with, was new slaves, and his grandfather was a slave, right? So it begins to separate contemporary concern from the actual harm. So how do explicit symbols encourage political action? Explicit symbols have a direct message, right? No symbol has any inherent content, right? We have to build content, and we help direct and guide that content through the more explicit we make a symbol, right? So explicit symbols restrict contextual redefinition, right? So to use the Baldwin Hall symbol again as an example, if you were to take that and put that in a cemetery, in a garden, in a inside of a bank, instead of the water fountain, you put that there, you would change what it means. Whether or not you have the words visible makes it something that can be totally recontextualized as something different. Explicit symbols restrict that. You see that with the Athens Confederate Monument and other Confederate monuments in Georgia and throughout the South, with all of these protect the statue statutes, right? So in Georgia, we have 53-1. And it says you can't do a whole lot of stuff, right? It's doing its best and doing work to try to keep contextualization, particularly interpretive contextualization, from allowing us to get rid of these things. So explicit symbols have express content, and explicit symbols add immovable content to commons, right? So you see that again with 53.1. They, you know, a part of that statute says if you move it, you have to put it in somewhere in, you know, shorten it out a bit, but put it somewhere of equal standing, right? So there we go. So the Unbreakable Athens Confederate Monument, the reason why I say it's unbreakable is because of 53.1, and it's not just that, it's that statute and other statutes like it throughout the South uh, discourage political and institutional actors who might be interested in getting rid of these monuments to the Confederacy. It prevents them from cultivating the courage and the political will to do so, because they can hide behind the threat of lawsuits, right? Because the 53.1 says even a private person can pursue it. And if your DA won't charge somebody, then we'll send in the attorney general for the state to charge someone with damaging or moving or removing the statute, right? So it does that through all of these means, right? So I'm just trying to keep an eye on the time. All right.
We're good.
Okay.
We have about 8 minutes.
You know, you got Ms. Davis don't be playing. So vague symbol, right, is insufficient. So I'll briefly speak on John Lee Eberhart without going into I would like to talk more about who he is and who he was as a person, but what we need to remember most prominently for symbolism purposes is he was a Black man that was dragged out of the Athens courthouse, chained to a tree and burned alive, right? Here in Athens, right? Dragged out of the courthouse, right? So a vague symbol to recognize in recognition as a step towards redress, not recognition as redress, but recognition as a step towards redress. A vague symbol would be insufficient, right? So a vague symbol as it relates to Mr. Eberhart would be a placard in Memorial Park that says lynching was bad, or even says his individual lynching was bad, right? An explicit symbol for Mr. Eberhart would be a memorial placard on the steps of the courthouse he was dragged from, right? That would be an explicit symbol. It would be something that is very direct. It would be something that restricts contextual redefinition. It would have content, right? Express content, and it would be a part of the commons, and it would cause frequent, if not constant, critical reflection on what we did to him and his family, right? So I think about this also when I think about Linnentown and this any explicit symbolism, erecting explicit symbols is a basic step in recognition. Linnentown was a individual families. It wasn't in one thing that happened. Numerous families were destroyed, right? I think a lot about an example is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, right? He talks about Levittown, Pennsylvania, which was like one of the first suburbs, right? And talks about those houses being sold at the time for I think like $8,000, which would be like 40 something today. And those houses are now worth $300,000 to $400,000, right? Like those are individual and specific robberies and plunders, and the families in Linnentown would individually rob, not as like some big thing, but as each individual family. Recognition, a placard for each family that was plundered and robbed is explicit, right? A marble thing that says Linnentown was bad is not explicit. It is vague and can be interpreted any kind of way, and it doesn't get us as a step closer towards redress, towards repayment. And UGA and Athens needs to pay what they owe. And part of that payment is not just a check, but also rehousing those families back into homes that make sense in a community that makes sense, right? So that is that. And then understanding harm and redress. Harm is a personal and communal, let me see, we run out of time. So redress, the point is redress presupposes recognition. Redress is really a gestalt of material, political, and economic outcomes. But many times the state and the institutions that support it and make it up use symbolism to dodge redress, right? So instead of paying you, we're gonna do a street and name it after somebody who we let get killed, right? Someone who we let get dragged out of a courthouse, or a family that we destroyed and put up student housing, right? And so the next steps, I try to always have next steps, and that's commitment and confrontation, right? Commitment to an express and explicit dissatisfaction with the attitudes, perspective, and outcomes provided by the institutions, and an express and explicit sought after goal of justice for these individual families, right? And confrontation is direct. It's also express, and not seeking concession, goal-directed political action as opposed to apolitical action, which they've beat a lot of Black folk down so much they've become, some of us are apolitical, right? We don't want to participate because we don't think our vote matters. And on some levels, some people are right. But if we through collective action, I think we can improve that. But progress, meaning improved conditions, don't cause retreat or inaction, right? And although we're not confrontational, political action is not concession seeking. Concessions as steps towards the ultimate goal is appropriate, right? So radical reform as radical political action outcomes towards revolution. And by reform, I mean using the current tools and mechanisms of the institution differently, right? We have a progressive DA now, right? So maybe we start seeing those sorts of changes, but but that's an example of radical reform, right? So that's it. I think I'm right on time. I have my little timer. Yeah, I have my little timer going and everything.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Travis. Obviously, this is a conversation that needs to continue, and I'm sure that it will. And I'm hoping that we'll actually be able to help facilitate that continued dialogue. There were a couple of things that you said, and it's too much. So probably what we'll do is, if people have additional questions for you or different comments, we'll invite them to post those on our website, and then we'll get those to you in a way that you can particularly respond to those.
And they can also email me at my UGA email, which is T as in Travis, Will as in my last name, WILL, the number 6 at uga.edu.
Say that again. T as in
Will 6 at uga.edu.
And that is your profession of faith, and that is what you do. So thank you so much. We appreciate you for joining us.
Thank you.
Take care. That concludes this session for our symposium today, and your next session will begin shortly.